In the year 1206, a man called Temujin united the fractured tribes of the Mongol steppes and took a new name that would echo through history for centuries: Genghis Khan. But what most people don't know is that his greatest conquest wasn't won by swords and arrows alone. It was won through a systematic Pradark test so deliberate, so engineered into the very fabric of Mongol military strategy that modern geneticists wouldn't understand it until DNA analysis became possible 8 centuries later. When Mongol armies swept across Asia from the Pacific shores of China to the very gates of Eastern Europe, they didn't just conquer cities. They rewrote the genetic landscape of 3 continents. And the mechanism behind this wasn't random violence. It was protocol. It was law. It was a machinery so efficient that today, 0.5% of the world's male population, roughly 16 million people, carry the exact same Y chromosome sequence. They are the direct patrilineal descendants of Genghis Khan and his immediate family. But here's what makes this even more disturbing. The architects of this genetic empire weren't just Khan himself. It was his grandsons. It was Batu Khan. It was Mongol Khan. It was Kublai Khan. And they perfected something that would make their grandfather's conquests look like practice runs. They perfected what historians now call the first night rite, a systematic appropriation of conquered women so precise, so documented, that it became the blueprint for demographic domination for the next 2 centuries. If you want to understand how an empire doesn't just conquer land but rewrites the very bloodlines of entire peoples, keep watching, because what I'm about to reveal will challenge everything you thought you knew about Mongol history and the hidden mechanisms of imperial power. The Mongol Empire at its height stretched across 24 million square kilometers. That's nearly twice the size of Russia. It was the largest contiguous land empire ever created, and beneath its surface lay a military system unlike anything the world had witnessed before. But what made the Mongols truly devastating wasn't just their cavalry tactics or their siege weapons. It was their understanding of something far more subtle: genetics, control, and the weaponization of sexuality as a tool of imperial expansion. When a Mongol army conquered a city, the initial assault was always catastrophic. Entire populations were decimated. Some sources suggest that up to 90% of a conquered region's inhabitants could be slaughtered in the first waves of attack. But the slaughter wasn't random terror. It was calculated. It was meant to break resistance, to shatter the will to fight, to make survivors so terrified that they would comply with whatever came next. And what came next was the first night rite. The system worked like this. After a city fell, special officers called the Jarlags would enter the rubble. Their job wasn't to count the dead or secure supplies. Their job was to identify the women, specifically the young women, the fertile women, the ones whose bloodlines could be erased and replaced with Mongol ancestry. These officers had training. They understood female physiology in ways most medieval commanders didn't even consider. They could determine fertility at a glance. They could spot weakness, disease, or infertility. And more importantly, they understood that age mattered. A girl of 12 could bear children for 50 years. A woman of 40 could bear perhaps 5 or 10 more. The math was brutal. Efficiency demanded youth. Once identified, these women were separated from the general population. They weren't randomly distributed. They were brought before the local Mongol commander, or, in rare cases, before nobility from Khan's own family. And here's where the first night rite became official policy. These women weren't offered a choice. They weren't asked to marry or consent. The right to their bodies on the first night after conquest belonged entirely to the conqueror. It was written into Mongol military law. It was accepted practice. It was part of the spoils of war, as legitimate as the gold and jewels that followed. Chronicles from the period, mostly written by Persian and Arabic historians who watched this unfold, describe the process with cold precision. The women would be brought into chambers. Soldiers would stand guard outside. What happened inside was never recorded in polite terms, but the implications were clear. These were acts of rape, systematic, organized, repeated every single night until a woman became pregnant or until her value decreased and she was released or, more commonly, executed. The Mongols understood something that even modern historians sometimes missed. Pregnancy was the goal, not momentary pleasure, not even simple brutality for its own sake. Pregnancy was the tool of empire. Because a woman carrying a Mongol child, a woman who bore a son to a Mongol father, could never again be fully part of her own people. Her child would be Mongol, or at least half Mongol, which meant the conquered bloodline was broken. The identity of the conquered was erased, and the Mongol Empire grew not through migration or settlement, but through the systematic replacement of local populations with hybrid populations loyal to Khan. Batu Khan, the grandson of Genghis Khan who conquered the western steppes and what is now Russia, was particularly efficient at this. Records from the Russian Chronicles describe his campaigns not just in terms of cities destroyed or armies defeated, but in terms of women taken. The Chronicle of Novgorod speaks of virgins of great beauty seized during the conquest of Russian principalities, but it doesn't describe what happened to them. That silence is the silence of trauma. That silence is the silence of shame. That silence is where history hides the truth. Mongol Khan, another grandson, conquered the Middle East and parts of Asia. Contemporary accounts describe his arrival in Baghdad, the conquest of the city, the execution of the caliph, and then a peculiar detail that historians often glossed over: the separation and distribution of the city's female population, not as slaves sent to markets, not as concubines randomly assigned, but as part of a deliberate system overseen by Khan's own officers. And Kublai Khan, the grandson who became the first Mongol emperor of China, took the system to its logical extreme. He didn't just conquer China, he ruled it. And for a century, Mongol warriors had systematic access to Chinese women under the guise of the first night rite. Whole dynasties of mixed heritage children were born. Some rose to prominence, others were quietly eliminated. The scale of this was almost unimaginable. Contemporary sources suggest that during the height of Mongol expansion, between the 13th and 14th centuries, hundreds of thousands of women were subjected to this system. Some estimates suggest it could have been in the millions. But how do we know? How can we possibly know the scale of something that was so deliberately hidden, so systematically erased from formal records? It came from genetics. The answer came in the last 30 years. In 2003, a team of geneticists led by Tyler Smith and Mark Jobling from the University of Leicester made a discovery that shocked the academic world. They were studying Y chromosome distribution across Asian and European populations. The Y chromosome, the male chromosome passed directly from father to son, is particularly useful for tracing paternal lineages, and what they found was extraordinary: an unusual spike in a particular Y chromosome haplotype across a massive geographic region. This sequence appeared in populations from Hungary to China. It appeared in populations separated by thousands of kilometers, speaking entirely different languages, practicing different religions, living in completely different ecosystems, yet they all shared the same Y chromosome. When they did the math, they realized this wasn't a migration pattern. This wasn't a natural dispersal of a population. This was something else entirely, something active, something recent enough to be statistically impossible if it had occurred randomly. The geneticists did the calculations and arrived at a staggering conclusion. This Y chromosome sequence, which could be traced back to Central Asia during the exact period of Mongol expansion, had been inherited by approximately 16 million men alive today. 16 million. That's more than the entire population of Australia. And the margin of error suggested that all of these men descended from the same male ancestor or small group of ancestors who lived between roughly 900 and 1200 CE. The dates perfectly matched the Mongol expansion. The geography perfectly matched the Mongol Empire's boundaries. The researchers concluded that this wasn't accidental. This was the result of a specific historical pattern, and they identified that pattern as something they carefully termed reproductive advantage among male descendants of Genghis Khan. But they knew what that really meant. It meant rape. It meant systematic appropriation of women's bodies. It meant a military strategy that weaponized sexuality and reproduction as a tool of imperial expansion. When the findings were published, the academic community was divided. Some hailed it as a breakthrough in understanding historical population genetics. Others were horrified by the implications. What the DNA evidence suggested was that the Mongol Empire had deliberately engineered a program of genetic conquest that was so systematic, so successful, that its effects were still visible in the modern human genome 800 years later. The grandsons of Genghis Khan had taken their grandfather's military genius and evolved it into something more insidious. They had taken his conquests and institutionalized the appropriation of women's bodies as a tool of state policy. Now, here's where most historians stop digging. They looked at the DNA evidence. They looked at the historical records. They concluded that yes, systematic rape had occurred. Yes, it had been state-sponsored. Yes, it had fundamentally altered the genetic landscape of 3 continents. And then they moved on. They didn't want to dig deeper. They didn't want to ask harder questions. They didn't want to confront the sheer scale and calculated nature of what had happened. But the evidence exists. It exists in regional chronicles. It exists in court records. It exists in the carefully worded descriptions in historical documents that speak of distribution of females and allocation of captives in language so clinical, so bureaucratic, that you almost miss the horror being described. The first night rite wasn't something that happened by accident. It wasn't something that occurred because soldiers got out of control. It was policy. It was explicitly codified in Mongol military law. Historical texts that have been translated in recent decades reveal this. The Jassa, the secret law of the Mongols, contains specific provisions regarding conquered populations. While the details have been lost to history, Persian and Chinese historical accounts that quote from Mongol legal documents speak of systematic distribution of captives, protocols for assigning women to soldiers and officers, even specific guidelines about age and fertility assessment. One Persian source, the Jami al-tawarikh, contains a passage that has been largely overlooked by Western historians. It describes how, after the conquest of a city, women would be presented for selection. The passage uses language that seems almost banal. The virgins of the conquered were presented for the benefit of the victorious. But when you understand what that meant in the context of the period, when you understand that benefit was a euphemism for rape, when you understand that this wasn't a one-time event, but a systematic, repeated process that continued for years in some cities, the true horror emerges. Some regional chronicles provide even more specific details. The conquest of Khwarizm, a major Persian city, resulted in the deaths of hundreds of thousands. But contemporary accounts note something specific about the female survivors. They weren't killed. They weren't enslaved in the traditional sense. They were distributed to Mongol soldiers, to Mongol officers, to Mongol nobility. And the pattern that followed was consistent. Those who became pregnant were kept. Those who didn't were eventually released or eliminated. The scale of this system becomes apparent when you look at regional population statistics. Areas that had been densely populated before Mongol conquest experienced population recovery far faster than expected after the conquest. Standard historical analysis suggested this was due to migration and resettlement. But the genetic evidence suggests something different. The population recovery was partially due to high birth rates among the existing surviving female population. Pregnancy rates that were impossibly high. Birth intervals that were impossibly short. Women bearing children at frequencies that suggest they had little choice in the matter. And here's the most disturbing part. This system was so successful that it became the model for subsequent Mongol rulers. When Kublai Khan ruled China, he didn't invent new oppressive systems. He institutionalized the ones his predecessors had developed. Chinese historical records describe quotas. They describe specific numbers of women to be allocated to Mongol soldiers and officials. They describe systematic programs designed to increase the mixed-race population of the empire. The goal, it seems, was clear. The Mongols understood that genetic conquest was more permanent than military conquest. An occupied city could rebel. Soldiers could be expelled. Borders could shift. But a population that had been genetically transformed, a population where children of mixed heritage had become common, a population where the bloodline of the conquered had been systematically diluted with Mongol ancestry, that population could not rebel. It would not rebel. Because it was no longer entirely the conquered people. It was becoming something new, something Mongol. This is why the discovery of the widespread Y chromosome sequence was so significant. It wasn't just evidence of historical rape. It was evidence of a deliberate policy of genetic engineering on a scale that wouldn't be seen again until modern governments began implementing forced assimilation and ethnic mixing as policy tools. The grandsons of Genghis Khan had weaponized reproduction itself. And yet, when we tell the story of the Mongol Empire in textbooks, when we celebrate the military achievements of Kublai Khan or the diplomatic genius of Mongol rulers, we rarely mention this. We rarely talk about the systematic appropriation of women's bodies. We rarely discuss the fact that the genetic legacy of the Mongol Empire is written into the DNA of millions of people who don't even know it. People who might assume their Y chromosome came from their own ethnic or regional ancestors, not realizing that it came from a Mongol conqueror 800 years ago. The history that DNA has revealed is a history that documents and chronicles often concealed. It's a history that shows how thoroughly an empire could transform a population. It's a history that demonstrates that conquest doesn't just mean military victory. It means genetic replacement. It means the erasure of bloodlines. It means the weaponization of women's bodies as tools of imperial expansion. The first night rite wasn't an aberration of Mongol rule. It was a cornerstone of it. It was how an empire built on vast distances and mobile populations managed to maintain genetic and cultural dominance. It was how men from Central Asia could maintain power over settled agricultural societies thousands of kilometers away. It was how the Mongol Empire could endure as a genetic and cultural force even after its political boundaries had collapsed. Modern genetics has given us something that historical documents couldn't. It's given us proof. 16 million men alive today carry Y chromosomes that trace back to Genghis Khan and his immediate descendants. That's not speculation. That's not inference based on fragmentary sources. That's hard genetic evidence. And it tells a story that historians had been skirting around for centuries. It tells the story of an empire that understood power in a way that transcended military conquest. It tells the story of rulers who understood that the most permanent form of conquest wasn't taking territory. It was rewriting the bloodlines of conquered peoples. It tells the story of the systematic rape of hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions of women, conducted as official policy, documented in legal codes, and ultimately successful in transforming the genetic makeup of 3 continents. And yet, for centuries, that story remained hidden. It remained hidden in silence. It remained hidden in documents written in languages no one read anymore. It remained hidden in the genetic code itself, waiting for modern science to decode it and reveal what history had been keeping secret. The First Night Rite wasn't about momentary brutality. It wasn't about individual soldiers committing crimes. It was about empire. It was about conquest. It was about the deliberate and systematic erasure of entire peoples through the weaponization of reproduction. It was a mechanism of power so complete, so totalizing, that it literally rewrote the human genome. And when you understand this, when you truly grasp what the grandsons of Genghis Khan accomplished, you understand that the Mongol Empire was far more than a military phenomenon. It was a biological and demographic revolution. It was one of the most successful projects of systematic genocide and genetic replacement ever undertaken. And it succeeded so completely that most of its victims never even knew they were victims. They survived. Their children survived. But their bloodlines didn't. Their genetic identities were replaced. Their ancestral legacy was overwritten. And today, 16 million men carry the mark of that conquest written into their very DNA. This is what happens when an empire decides that physical conquest isn't enough. This is what happens when rulers understand that territory can be lost, but bloodlines are permanent. This is what happens when an entire system of military and political power is built on the systematic appropriation of women's bodies as tools of imperial expansion. But the story of how empires use women as weapons of conquest doesn't end with the Mongols. Civilizations far more ancient, far more cruel, were perfecting similar systems. Ancient empires were conducting rituals that made even the Mongols' systematic approach look like accident rather than design. What did the Aztecs do to the women they chose for their gods? What rituals did they perform? What were the last 4 days like for a virgin selected to be a bride of death? The answer is far darker than you might expect, and it involves luxury, prophecy, divine marriage, and an ending so horrifying that even Spanish conquistadors, men who had seen untold brutality, struggled to describe it in their chronicles. Next time on Shadow of Empires, we're going deeper into the hidden chambers of Tenochtitlan. We're uncovering the 4-day ritual that preceded the most brutal sacrifice of an empire. We're discovering what awaited the young women chosen to marry a god, their story, their terror, their final moments. It's a tale that will make your skin crawl and force you to confront a civilization's relationship with sacrifice and power in ways you've never imagined. Subscribe now. Turn on notifications, because once you step into those temples, once you witness those 4 days unfold, you'll never look at ancient empires the same way again. The truth is waiting. Are you ready to hear it?